Hi all, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my show where we talk about storytelling in all its forms. Today's guest is Chantal Lyons. She is a naturalist, writer, and science communicator. Having grown up in the tidy countryside of Kent, her encounters with the growing rewilding movement opened her eyes to the potential for restoring nature in Britain and inspired her to study the relations between people and wild boar in the Forest of Dean. She currently lives in Cheltenham, never too far from the boar. Her book, The Groundbreakers, explores a journey of discovery as she reveals what it might take for us to coexist with wild boar, newly reintroduced after centuries of absence in England. Thank you so much for coming, Chantal. I am so excited to be talking to you about all things wild boar. Everybody who knows anything about my writing or my childhood that I talk about in interviews knows how much I love that animal. So I am so excited to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be on your show. I think we're going to have a really fascinating conversation, and I'm really keen to hear about your own experiences with wild boar and maybe even how sort of that has translated onto the page for you, because I did enjoy, I enjoyed both of your books, but I was so happy to see wild boar get representation, especially in your second book.
Yes, at the beginning of your book, you actually mentioned how there's not much sort of wild boar representation in sort of popular fiction, and I was just sitting there thinking, like, what about my book?
Yeah, I know, because I'd read. I think I'm sorry, but I handed my manuscript in before I read.
If I'd only known.
Yeah.
If I'd only known.
Yeah.
Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about your book and what inspired it?
Yeah, so the book kind of covers both all the human and the ecological elements of the return of wild boar to the UK. We drove them to extinction hundreds of years ago. They started to come back in sort of the 1980s. And when I say come back, obviously they couldn't come back across the
They
English
didn't
Channel.
swim, yeah.
Yeah, no, they didn't. They can swim, but not that far. But farmers started importing them to raise them for their meat in the 1980s, and they began to escape. In a few cases, it seems that people released them illegally because it's illegal to release them under our law. And some populations began from that, sparks taking hold, setting the country aflame, essentially. You can maybe edit that bit out. So the book is about what does that mean for us, for our landscapes, for our wildlife, and what is it like to be a boar living in the country today.
It's fascinating to sort of watch this process in real time because obviously England is an incredibly ecologically impoverished country, and when people think about nature, because it's very green country, so we don't tend to think about it as being very impoverished in terms of nature, but none of it's natural, right? So your book goes into quite a bit of detail about how this animal that was sort of native to the islands as well, albeit hundreds of years ago, does it quite fit now into what's left? And I've seen like little hints that like you are the sort of rewilding projects are very like seen now as a future of our ecosystem. It's the future of sort of nature conservation. How do you approach it?
So when you say how do I approach it, do you mean sort of the topic of rewilding in the book?
Not just in the book, because I've seen that you have quite a bit to say, so I don't want to talk for you, but I've seen you sort of mention the Yellowstone sort of reintroduction of wolves, and obviously that is the narrative about the great success of rewilding projects.
Yeah, so what I was especially keen to do with this book was to be as balanced and as nuanced as possible, and to acknowledge all the often inconvenient realities of rewilding, of living with animals like wild boar. So I mentioned the Yellowstone case into the introduction because I feel like these days we can't move for books and articles just talking about, oh, the Yellowstone wolves. That is a perfect example of what happens when you reintroduce keystone species. It created this beautiful ecological cascade. It's all hunky-dory now, and the wolves completely fixed our damage. And there is a bit of, it's a grain of truth in that, definitely. But I think the risk is in over-promising. It can cause a backlash and disillusion people, and then make it harder for us to justify doing reintroductions of wolves and other animals such as boar in the future. Because in the case of Yellowstone, actually, a lot of the initial hype around the wolves, when you actually, a lot of scientists are now saying, well, actually, no, none of this is all such an oversimplification, and we got overexcited, and it's not actually happening. It's a lot more complex than that. Our damage goes so deep, there's never going to be a quick fix. And that's the same with the wild boar. They are really essential, and we won't be able to start healing the damage without them, but they're also not an answer in themselves. And there are, obviously there are places and there are cases where wild boar will not help. They could even make things worse. So, for example, one species I mentioned in the book is the adder, also known as the European viper. So that in the UK, that species is very threatened, and in places like the Forest of Dean, which is where a lot of the book focuses on, the adders their population is good, but it's almost like the Forest of Dean is an ark. It's a refuge for them, and the risk is that wild boar, which do eat adders if they get the chance, could really affect that population, which would be very bad news because it's literally one of the only places left in the country where adders are kind of doing okay. When that's entirely our fault, and it's not the boar's fault, but it is a sad fact that we have damaged our world so much that some of the animals that were used to be incredibly important to our ecosystems now could make things worse.
Yes, and
but
fixing the damage
yeah.
is a lot more complicated, and I think, but that is a real difficulty. And you're a science communicator, right, as well as a scientist, and it's that is, I think, really key to sort of preserving the environment at the moment, because, or to even try to wind back the clock a little bit, because at the moment people tend to feel overwhelmed. I think, like when we sort of see the level of kind of ecological disaster that is sort of happening across the globe. It's not just happening, we've done it, but also when it comes to sort of more locally in England, like this country is just so impoverished in terms of its natural environment, and that even though there's many species of animals, like you say in the book, a lot of them are functionally extinct, which maybe you can sort of talk a little bit more about that and why it matters.
Yeah, so functional extinction is where the species itself is still around. There are still populations, or there are still individuals, but there are so few of them that they just can't do what they used to do in their ecosystems. So I say that the wild boar are functionally extinct in Kent and East Sussex, which is a corner of England in the southeast, and that's where there was for a while it was a good population, as in it looked like, if they were left alone, then that population could have grown and could have really thrived, but they've all been essentially just poached or legally shot. So there's pretty much just a handful left of them now, it seems, based on how few sightings there are. Which means that there's so few of them that they're not having the kind of impact on the landscape that really we need them to have, and it's very sad. It's this, these animals have died out in one way already, or died out again, because of course they died out originally 700 years ago, and we're making them re-extinct in parts of England where they came back to, except in the Forest of Dean. And I think actually, just to I didn't quite answer your question earlier of what brought me to the story, and what, how did the story happen, and that was because I went there in 2014, so 10 years ago, and at the time I was studying for a master's dissertation in environmental social science, and I went to the Forest of Dean to speak to people living there about what it was like to live with wild boar, because it was such a unique experience in the UK. Obviously in Poland completely different. But we are just not used to living with anything like a wild boar. For generations, we haven't needed to think about it. So I wanted to find out what it was like to actually suddenly be this completely different human being in a way, or have this completely new experience that no one else in the country is able to share with you. And sort of the positive and the negative sort of consequences of that. And that's where the story began.
It's interesting how like you actually do give space for the sort of negative connotations as well. And because like you say, it's a danger of trying to be over positive, but also that makes communicating the solutions harder, I think, for
Mm.
scientists, because people are looking for clear answers. So it's like, okay, so the wolves fixed Yellowstone, right? So okay, let's get some wolves in Scotland, right? It'll be all great. Like, and how do you fix that communication? Because you are not working in isolation. You're working
Mm.
against I mean, you could call it like anti-wildlife propaganda from
Mm.
the farming industry and from, meat production industries who are not happy about reintroducing wild boar, who are not happy about reintroducing wolves, and they spread all kinds of nonsense, some or often very nonsensical news stories about how it affects humans to sort of to push against the rewilding efforts.
Mm. Yeah, and it is so hard, especially in this day and age, people's limited attention spans, I guess, and the clickbait article headlines. I mean, one thing definitely to be mindful of is sort of, I love being on Twitter. It's sort of I that's my social media home, but it is an echo chamber. And you always get these, when I mean, recently when the Scottish government put out this poster about wild boar, or what they call
Oh,
feral
I saw
pigs.
it.
They refuse to call them wild boar. Yeah, saying oh, report feral pigs because of the risk of African swine fever, which is this disease that is
Yeah,
in
I saw
some,
that. It
yeah.
made me quite cross, actually.
Oh yeah, yeah. But there was loads of backlash to that. Lots of angry comments from rewilders and sort of pro boar people
Yes.
commenting on that. But you just think, I mean, okay, that's just us, this group of rewilding people on Twitter. I mean, we've got to reach other people, and I mean that's obviously with the book. I do hope that will reach a lot of other people. But we've just got to use every platform we can, and social media platforms, other forms of media, meeting people in person. Obviously, charities. There are lots, sort of there are a few rewilding charities these days. So there's Rewilding Britain, there's Heal Rewilding, and then up in Scotland, there's Scotland the Big Picture, and various other sort of smaller rewilding charities. So there's we've got to sort of kind of attack from all angles basically, and constantly, yeah, we've got to be on our guard, and we've got to counter misinformation. But we do also, we've talked about, we mustn't overpromise, and we also mustn't is sort of ignore or disregard people's concerns. I mean, one
Yes.
other example I mentioned in the book is the white-tailed eagles in Scotland. And farmers at the time of their reintroduction, I think it was starting in the 1980s, they were told, no, they will never attack your lambs, don't worry. And most of the time, yeah, they don't attack lambs, but occasionally they do. So that has
Yeah.
caused a huge, huge problem in terms of buy-in and support for other in reintroductions, because the farmers are saying we've been treated, we've been taken for a ride, we've been lied to, and we're not treated seriously. Our concerns are not treated seriously. So
Yes.
yeah, we've got to be realistic, and
I
but at
think
the same,
it's
but
a
never
lot.
forget, yeah.
That is the kind of messaging issue that we've seen come to a head on all kinds of different issues recently, when it comes to Brexit, and, how you had half a population just sort of completely ignore the other half.
Mm,
Any concerns, it was ridiculed. And so we
yeah.
had this protest vote that resulted in Brexit. And, when it comes to like, medicine, and we had the messaging was so off when it comes to COVID vaccinations, for example, right? Because if you promise that there are no side effects, and then like AstraZeneca was like withdrawn because people did have side effects. Most people did not, but there were some, and you're trying to like pretend that it's not happening. That is damaging trust across the board. So even if that percentage of people who actually had adverse reaction was very small, you have completely ruined your credibility by pretending that it doesn't exist. And I found your approach quite refreshing in terms of the honesty that you're kind of presenting, but you're not saying that, you know, it's 100%, you know, going to work, that it's definitely going to be the greatest thing, Wild Boar on this island, or at least not in isolation, right?
Exactly.
But also I was I was also like, a part of me was a little bit worried because, you know, this is not very clickbaity, like, you know, and that's what people have come to expect. So it's like, how do you make it like clear enough in communication? So what do you think like the balance is?
Well, certainly still highlighting the really cool, amazing stuff about Wild Boar, getting people excited. I think also sharing things that will hopefully make people go, wow, I never thought about that. And one example for me is the soil mites and the mycorrhizal fungi. And I talk about that in the chapter Monstrous Appetites. And this is one of the things I say. You know, I feel like there is so much attention on what wild boar are eating, and very little attention on, you know, what they're pooing out, basically. And one of the key ecological roles of wild boar is dispersing other organisms through the landscape, and they're really good at doing that through their dung, because when they are foraging through the soil, when they're rooting, you know, they're taking in a lot of spores from mycorrhizal fungi, which I think a lot of people by now, thanks to all the research and the books that have been written about it, know that mycorrhizal fungi is really important for woodlands, for trees. You know, it's just these tiny sort of species of fungi which bind with the roots of trees and help them to obtain nutrients. A wild boar are really quite integral to helping to spread the spores of that fungi. So essentially, they're almost these sort of like these ecological gifts that the boar is sprinkling all over the land, basically, to help trees grow.
I mean, that's a focus in a kind of reintroduction of buffalo in North America, isn't it? In the USA specifically, it's just basically that is that we're almost reversing desertification of whole parts of land by spreading plant seeds and fertilizing the soil.
And exactly. And I definitely, I mean, I suppose in the book I've tried to sort of introduce a slight sort of fantasy feel to some of it, in terms of, you know, talking about you know, sort of fairy tales and myth, and sort of just almost circle. You know, I do feel like there's a lot of, when it comes to rewilding and the reintroduction of these animals, there is something very spellbinding and magical about the ways that it's almost like, you know, sort of breaking a curse or something, when we're putting them back and we're reanimating these beautiful processes, these ecological processes. So I hope that in a way people will get a sense of magic from things like the fact that wild boar spread these spores in their dung, and potentially even those tiny sort of soil microinvertebrates that I talk about a bit as well. You know, incredible that these animals do seem to be capable of being eaten by the boar and then passing through their digestive systems and then surviving to tell the tale.
It's I love that you mentioned the fairy tale like status of wild boar, because I think that is the absolute right way to describe it. And there's just something really majestic about wild boar. And it's interesting because people who are not very familiar with the animal, they might think of it as wild pig, or, you know, depending on who they're hearing from, they think of it as feral pig, you know, and they think of those poor farmed creatures that I kind of, you know, that well, they're not very dignified, and we don't offer them a very dignified existence. But then when you actually see wild boar, you know, in wild, there is something quite spellbinding about it. And I wanted to actually read out a little passage from your book, because I thought it was beautifully lyrical. So your So this is your reimagining of the last Wild Boar, and I thought this really encapsulated the feel of the book for me. But I find it hard to chase away a vision, a male boar hurrying through the undergrowth in an unremarked woodland somewhere else, his heart beating faster with every distant dog bark, the stench of wood smoke in his nose. He is old, wits gathered with the years. He knows these woods like he knows his own body. Both feel gnawed down. He does not know that he is the last, only that in the previous autumn there were no sows to mount, or at least no sows who shared his petal-shaped ears and bristly back. And now in spring he cannot hear the mothers granting to their babies. He hurries on. Perhaps it's a wandering dog who brings about his end. Or perhaps he is allowed to lie down in the soft shade of an oak in the heart of the woods. He slips away. I thought it was really beautiful. And I think that you really captured this power of imagination when it comes to thinking about the loss of ecosystems and the loss of different species, because humans do tend to focus on the poignancy of endings and irreversible change. Is this what drew you to the research?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what initially drew me to the research was the conflict that might be, that seemed to be happening between people and boar, but also, sort of my hope. I mean, I'd read a book the year before called Feral by George Monbiot, which introduced me and a lot of other people of my generation to the concept of rewilding. And I hadn't really thought about wild boar before then. Why would I? Because there are almost none in this country. And I'd had, like most other people, I'd had no exposure to them. But suddenly reading that book made me think, oh yeah, they're quite cool. I should pay more attention to them. And of course, there is a poignancy in the fact that they were lost, the fact that we still really haven't allowed them to return. Obviously, they have returned in a few spots in the country, but they live, they're always on a knife edge. Their future is not assured here. So essentially, we are still refusing to allow them to sort of fully return to their rightful place, to their throne. And it is awful that, in some places they have been lost again. And it is tragic. But there is also, sort of there's this, I love the word, the chiaroscuro, the light and the dark. The story has dark shades and light shades.
Yes, I think that sort of juxtaposition of the light and the dark is it's quintessentially how we sort of through history humans have viewed wild boar, right? Like, so it's not just a pretty animal that flits here and there. It's not just a meat source. It's not, it's a worthy adversary, right?
Yes.
So my grandfather, who was a hunter, he was a forester's son, he hunted wild boar. So I actually, on the one podcast, I gave like my family recipe for wild boar pashtet.
Oh, wow.
Which is so, but he always had this huge respect for wild boar. And that is something that I remember, he would draw me pictures of wild boar. And I remember we would go into the forest and he would show me how to sort of figure out where the wild boar went, where their routings, how fresh they were, things like that. And the routings will look, routings as in for our listeners, so those are the areas where the wild boar sort of dig with their snouts into the ground, overturning a lot of the ground. And those will look different in Poland because of a different soil to England, which is mostly sort of clay.
Oh, interesting. I'd be fascinated to see what that looks like.
That was actually something that I found very interesting in when you mention there's this passage in a book where you talk about how the earth is not meant to be straight, and we'll come back to it in a moment. But I was thinking about how you talk about the rootings kind of remain, that like when the wild boar go through and they overturn the earth, and that it kind of stays like that.
Yeah.
So it's not so in the forest that I'm familiar with, that isn't necessarily the case because the soil is much softer. So those and it doesn't dry in quite the same way. So it's sort of over time it kind of settles, you know, because like the rain falls and then kind of smooths it over and sort of pats it down. So there's a different sort of sense of permanence and impermanence in there. But even, you know, when I was reading about, I don't quite remember like where I read about it, but apparently in like early medieval England, hunting for wild boar was considered to be more dangerous than hunting for the bear.
Wow.
So, and this sense of danger is still there, and it can, you know, bring a sense of sort of respect, right? But it also has its downside when you're, you know, trying to convince people of.
Yeah.
So can you sort of talk about that aspect of danger and, you know, how realistically, you know, do you sort of approach it, like reassuring people or?
Yes, I mean it's in the UK is a weird case. I mean, weird is the right word because we're out of the ordinary because across most of the world, people still live with dangerous animals, whether those are venomous snakes or sharks, or big animals. Even, you know, from the USA to Sri Lanka, you know, leopards, lions, elephants, wolves, bears,
Even though the
and with
danger is minuscule most
yeah,
of the time.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And here in the UK, we it's sort of the big we have red deer. They're big, but they are not really dangerous unless one runs in front of your car. We have
Unless
badgers
you're
and
being dumb,
foxes.
yeah, as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But even then, I feel like you'd be quite an achievement to sort of be injured by a red deer. But yeah, so we have no, but you know, we'd have no animals that you know make us stop and think, oh, I'm a bit scared. Except occasionally with foxes, people get a bit hysterical with them. But you know, essentially, we are these people who are kind of mollycoddled in a way, cosseted. You know, and the wild boar scares us because they are unfamiliar. We have heard a lot of things. Sort of, I think you know, people do. You know, sort of our brains are sort of tuned to pick up negative details and cling to those negative details. So it's very easy for us to sort of have these unfair representations of war in our heads. And there is a danger, of course, but it's interesting when I went to the Forest of Dean for the first time in 2014 and spoke to people, the people who hated the wild boar or feared them would always say, almost word for word, well, usually word for word, it's only a matter of time before a child is killed. And yeah, obviously 10 years later, that hasn't happened. Wild boar have been back in the country for over 30 years by this point. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened anywhere else either. You know, apart from a few very rare cases in the last century or so.
I mean,
It's not happened. Yeah.
I would suggest what my grandfather told me. If you see a wild boar in a forest, especially a mother with babies, climb a tree.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, even then, I
Stay
mean,
away
I know,
or just
yeah,
get away. They
yeah.
won't go pursue you because we're not predators, right? So
Yeah, yeah. Well, even predators. I mean, wolves will run away usually. You know, I mean,
yeah,
there's
I
been,
mean,
you know, there are, yeah.
it's running away is not the advice given with large
Mm,
predators, basically,
yeah,
because it kind of tends to trigger their like with
yeah.
bears or, but yes, so it's like it's interesting, you know, you're saying mollycoddled, and I think that is a very fair representation of the comfort level that people in this country tend to expect, because they don't grow up with not just dangerous animals, inconvenient animals. I mean, there's no
Inconvenient is the word, yeah.
mosquitoes here in any significant any significant volume, you know.
Yeah.
When when my UK family comes to Poland and they feel like, oh, there's mosquitoes everywhere, and I was like, where, like one mosquito, like get over it. You know?
Yeah.
Although now I've become a little bit spoiled too, but
Yeah,
But
there's convenient and inconvenient is the right word. The boar are inconvenient in other ways. Even if you are not personally scared of the boar, they do inconvenient things. In the Forest of Dean, they do sometimes overturn the bins. They're a bit like mini bears in that sense, because I know in the US they have a lot of problems with they have to bear proof bins and things like that, and we really need to boar proof our bins because of the boar. They're so good at tipping them over when they know. Apparently, they know when bin day is. So that's when they come. But
obviously it's
yeah,
buffet day, all you
yeah,
can eat
yeah,
buffet day.
yeah,
But
yeah.
it's the same way that, you know, foxes overturn bins all the time. And I got a
Mm,
fox-proof bin and haven't had trouble since. Because
yeah,
the simpler design, the local fox has figured out and kept overturning my bin every single bin day, which was driving me
yeah,
mental. But
yeah. But people are used to having foxes around, so it doesn't register.
it's
I
the
mean, yeah,
same
you
thing. You
don't,
just have to deal
yeah.
with it.
Yeah, you don't think, oh, it's unacceptable that we have to live with foxes, but that is the mindset that a lot of people still have. It is unacceptable that we should ever be expected to live with anything like a wild boar, even though objectively a wild boar is nowhere near as dangerous as living with an elephant, for example. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, even that, it's just a lot of those animals just will not bother you unless you bother them.
Mm,
And I wonder if it's to do with scale. Do you think it has something to do with scale? Like, because, you know, obviously Canadians, for example, live
mm,
with a host of dangerous animals. But the distance between, you know, the cities and the forests are a bit bigger. There's fewer people there. It's just, I don't know, people have sort of don't seem to have the same reaction that people in this country do. And I was thinking maybe it's because we're all like kind of squished together on this island.
mm. I don't know. I don't think. I think there's a correlation, but not a causation. I mean, in lots of places in North America, you do get animals, especially like black bears, going right into the heart of sort of almost urban areas. I think in the UK, it is simply the fact that, we are so nature impoverished. We have done a very good job of converting the whole country into this place that's much more comfortable for us, and that meets our needs, well, our desires. And it just so happens at the same time we've gotten rid of all these big animals. Sort of we've driven them out or wiped them out. And it's a small country, and yes, so we're all packed in here. And but yeah, so I don't think it's a sort of I don't think it's a sort of question of distance. It's just sort of the lack of familiarity, the fact that we
Mm.
are not used to sort of it is a selfish mindset in a way, this thing that we never should have to the world should bend around us, even though we know it can't happen like that. We know that with climate breakdown, the world is not bending around us. The world is coming back to bite us on the arse for sure.
Yes. I mean,
Yeah.
but we're not feeling it in the same way yet in this country
Mm,
that people in
no.
other countries do, you know,
Yeah.
like, and it's, um, I think over 1,000 years, people in this country definitely got very comfortable with the
Mm,
idea that this country is just like one big park. And like
yeah.
even when you talk about the Forest of Dean, where you did
Mm.
so much of your research, it's you mentioned it being moth eaten, like a moth
Yeah.
eaten tapestry or something like that.
Yeah.
And you know, with little houses here and little farms there. And so this is supposed to be a forest, like a national kind
Mm,
of reserve, you know, nature
yeah.
reserve. And it's just,
Yeah. That's as good as our forests get.
yes,
It's nothing
exactly.
like Białowieża, in Eastern Europe, that amazing sort of,
Białowieża, yes.
Yeah, I find it so hard to pronounce it. Yeah.
Polish is impossible to pronounce.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
Yes, about, you know, obviously we have our Poland has its challenges with
Hmm.
especially over the last you know, decade or so, or even longer, with the quite unhelpful attitudes from the governing sort of people who were not particular, they did not care about conserving the local environment very much, and
Mm.
so they have done a lot of damage, a lot of cutting down forests and sort of replanting them with just pine,
Mm.
you know, like, so you have um mixed forests, which have suddenly become like a monoculture of pine, because that grows quickly and you can sell it.
Yeah.
And yeah,
It's the same
but
story in so many places. And funny enough, actually, wild boar are a bit of a headache for for plantations, because actually they very often will move through new plantations, uprooting all the newly planted seedlings. So it's almost like they are the will of the wild. Again, going back to this fantasy fairy tale feeling, the wild
yes,
is sending them out to sort of undo the evil work of the humans. The
no,
retribution. Yeah.
I like to like, in the fantasy. So,
Yeah.
in my last book, like I have this wild boar god, and I kind of
Enoch.
felt Enoch, yes, and I
Yeah.
kind of because I felt like this is such a it feels so masculine as well. So he would obviously
Mm,
take like a human form, but because I felt like there is this, when we look at wild boar, there is like this human spirit in them as well, and
mm.
there is this like you say, like will of the forest, but it's something that we don't quite control, and I think people can feel really uncomfortable with anything they don't control. uh,
Yes. Yeah. But
I,
sometimes we're also drawn to it. I mean, funnily enough, I mean, Enoch, he is really sexy. And there is always this weird, I don't want to get too weird, but there is always this kind of, I feel like a lot of the representations that there are of wild boar in popular culture, there is this kind of undercurrent of sort of masculine, almost sexual energy. I mean, I also think it was series 2 or 3 of The Witcher. There's a character, a man who gets cursed, and he sort of gets turned into sort of, he has a sort of boorish head, like with tusks as well. And almost like the beast from Disney's The Beauty and the Beast.
mm,
There's a I think he's got a child, but yeah, like sort of that feel. But it's funny. I mean, it's interesting because there is an equal amount of feminine energy in wild boar. So the wild boar you're most likely to see are the females, the
I
sounders,
mean,
and they're led
very
by their
like,
matriarchs.
yes. So you say
Yeah.
say matriarch as well, like when
Yeah.
you and I found it very interesting. I had latched onto that because we they are they have similar family structures to
Mm.
elephants, you
Yeah.
mentioned, and so that is like a matriarchy where you have the biggest sort of female boar
Yeah. The
kind of
oldest, most
leading.
experienced one. Yeah.
And I was thinking about how humans always try to understand animals, and especially the sort of what we consider like more intelligent animals with more complex social structures, in human terms. And there are certain animals like, octopus that completely elude our ability to do that.
Mm.
And that is one of the kind of sources of interest that people have in this animal because of that. But also with wild boar, because of what you mentioned, that like there's this, we have this sense of like masculine energy about it, and because historically mostly men have been allowed to actually do
Yeah.
their research, you mentioned
Yeah.
but some of the interpretations are less
Mm.
than accurate,
Yeah.
and don't really bear closer scrutiny, like
Yeah. Like the harems, is that what you
yes.
think of? Yeah, I know. It's so true because it gets me so annoyed whenever I read about saying wild boar keep harems, and it's always a male writer. And obviously, red deer keep harems. The stags sort of, will sort of corral the females to an extent. But yeah, with wild boar, because of this matriarchal society, the females are already in their groups. It's like,
Mm.
it's not like the males turned up and said, "I have now gathered you together." It's literally the males just pitch up when they can tell that one of the females is in heat, and they just follow them around, probably being quite annoying in the process. But yeah, it always annoys me when I see that, oh, wild boar keep harems, in this authoritative voice, because it's not true.
I mean, there's some similarity here, I feel, to the like archaeological and ethnographical research to do
Mm.
with human societies, very
Oh yeah.
early human societies. So
Yeah.
like kind of prehistoric humans in Europe, it is now assumed that they were mostly matriarchal societies, where men were not really part of the groups. So
Mm.
it wasn't so much that like men went out hunting and women stayed gathering. It's just that women in a family formed a group, and then men would occasionally show up, but they weren't really a part of the group. So,
Okay.
but that is an interpretation that was not exactly popular because of cultural reasons. Because
Yeah.
you don't want to give women ideas, do you?
No, and it's the same thing. Oh, you always see this thing about when clearly, in the archaeological record, or sort of in sort of ancient art, that you've got these two homosexual lovers, and the archaeologist is like, oh, they were friends, clearly. Yeah, it's just like that. Yeah, you're right. And yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, and I think as well, probably, when we picture Mesolithic hunters, or sort of hunting wild boar, we probably always end up picturing men. And who knows? Maybe women sort of yeah. I'm sure women were just as capable of hunting wild boar when they did it. I mean, there's lots we don't know, but certainly we did used to hunt wild boar. But I think we would have had to devise a variety of ways, because they are, they're not. They are, in these days, they are not dangerous unless they're cornered. Most of the injuries that wild boar cause are to hunters, and that is,
Poachers.
yeah. So I'm sure wild boar would have been very dangerous quarry when they were wounded or cornered. Yeah.
Or were you try to hunt them with a spear? Then
Yeah.
yeah, that was a little
Yeah.
different proposition.
But yeah, sorry, I got a bit off track there.
No, at all. I mean, I find it really fascinating, like also when it comes to historical interpretations of nature, because it really stays with people. And so when I was reading that part, it made me think of a comic book, Wolves, that I read in Polish recently about. It's a comic book. There's this non-fiction comic book about the scientific research into wolves
Oh,
in Poland
wow.
and a little bit in Czech Republic. But it's basically debunking a lot of myths surrounding wolves. So a lot of people still think that they hunt that it's like, oh, the pack, like the pack, and they think of like all those different males and females, and it's just. And scientists are saying, like, well, no, we're just families. There's literally the mother and father and their children who eventually, and then a couple of years later, you're going to have a new set of children. So it's not like a group of unrelated adults.
Yeah.
You will not see that in sort of wolf societies. But that also drove a lot of negative connotations that people have of this like mob, almost like mob of feral animals.
Yeah, this mindless mob.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think talking about families, both for wolves and for boar and others, really imbues them with sort of a sense of personhood, which I think sort of indigenous societies have never lost that sense of, oh, other beings are people. They are lively, sort of sentient beings, and obviously that is something that we have lost, or we've lost sight of. And that's one thing I really want to do with the book, and like the passage you read out earlier with that wild boar, imagining what it might have been like to be the last wild boar, through his eyes, through his body, because I mean, yeah, so many animals, I'm sure, well, all animals are sentient in their own way, and that is something that we've denied for a long time. And wild boar, I think, must have very rich internal lives.
Yes, they are very intelligent animals as well, and it's like, do you feel like there's some myths about surrounding wild boar that particularly irritate you, that you feel like they have nothing to do with reality?
I think the carnivory, definitely, this belief that I think it's not been helped by, you have all these films like Hannibal, where the murderers will feed the bodies of their victims to like the pigs or the boar, and they'll get eaten. I mean, yeah, like a wild boar, if a wild boar finds a carcass and can smell it. Oh, it smells okay. There's no
Easy
disease there.
protein.
Yeah, they will eat it. Yeah, like, oh my God, free lunch. I would, I mean, obviously, I'm not just gonna. I'd probably pick up some roadkill, if it looked sort of it was fresh. But yeah, they 90% or so of the average wild boar's diet in Europe is plants. Basically, it is what the research has shown. But we do have this idea that they are quite bloodthirsty, and they will attack at any chance. They will literally, I mean, one person I spoke to in the Forest of Dean in 2014 genuinely was scared about the possibility of being eaten alive by them, which just goes to show, I mean, I hope no one in Poland would ever think that, anyone from a European country who's grown up with them. And exactly, yeah, it's crazy, but those are the thoughts that people have in this country.
Yeah, I mean, it was so interesting to me because there are many especially from farming communities, there are people who definitely are not necessarily pro wild boar very much, because they feel like, it will come to my field and one night it will overturn and eat everything.
That's fair.
Right?
Yeah.
So that is fair. However, that bloodthirsty myth I've never heard of, and that was really interesting for me to read. That is the fear here, but they will just attack, and there's like so much of wildlife, or like sheep, free roaming sheep that we have so many of in this country. They're far more at risk from dogs, poorly trained dogs, than they are from an omnivorous animal,
mostly plant eating animal
that eats dead things and plants. And it's because I'd never heard of a wild boar actually killing something and eating it, except for maybe like small things.
They certainly can do it, and they do it sometimes. We certainly mustn't sort of skirt around that fact. I mean, and Peter Wolleben, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but this German forester who is really wrote a book called The Secret Life of Trees, which has been really popular.
I love that book.
And I read one of his more recent books, The Power of Trees, and he actually mentioned in that book, which I've quoted in my book, that he has seen in the spring wild boar sort of quartering the meadows looking for newborn fawns. So if it can't get away, then they are going to try and eat it. But again, this is not something that happens all the time. It happens hardly any of the time. But we just can't help but focus on that.
I think it's like, I remember seeing someone, that's a social media post by someone. I have not verified this information in any way, but just a disclaimer. But when people are posting about like, the like teacup piglets, that they have a little pets, piglets, and this American woman commented that like her family has a hog farm, and she says like a couple hog can eat a body in
Oh yeah, I'm sure they can.
And like if you have epilepsy, if you have anything like that, like basically this is not an animal you should be keeping in the house, because if you go still, they'll eat you. But
yeah, that's kind of fair, because quite a lot of the injuries that have occurred with pigs is where people have like had heart attacks or strokes or something, fallen down in the pen and then have been eaten.
Yes. So I think it would be unreasonable to expect a large omnivorous animal to pass up on free lunch, and yet that is the standard that we're setting.
Yeah, exactly. We want we have this weird idea that they're not in their rightful place. We seem to get weirded out by these animals that blur the boundaries. I'll have a bit of meat, I'll have a bit of plants. We just don't like that. And I mean, there are many reasons we don't like them, or a lot of people don't like animals like boar, but that is one of them, I think.
I think we like things to be quite sanitized in general.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I think, and that's a very long-standing attitude. I think that with the way we look at nature now, that is a very recent phenomenon in human history. Like looking at nature as something beautiful, something to be cherished. That was not a common view until reasonably recently, I would say. And when you think, I remember at university sort of studying romantic literature, and there was this concept of sort of picturesque landscape, and And all of it was very sanitized,
Mm.
very curated. So there was this concept of like, oh, wild nature, but it couldn't be wild.
Yeah, yeah.
Because that would be kind of insane, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
you don't want it to be too wide. You want a park with a
Mm.
nice, freshly built ruin.
Yeah.
You know, that is the concept of nature. And you certainly don't want a wild boar overturning your pretty lawn around the ruin. That would kind of spoil the picture.
Yeah.
And that is something you kind of mentioned in depth about how sort of coming back to this idea of like the earth is not supposed to be flat.
Yeah.
The earth's not supposed to be flat. That's it. The soil is
The
not
soil,
the soil is not supposed to be flat. And we are in modern day kind of have this addiction, I would say, to straight
Yeah.
lines and
Yeah.
cleanliness. So can you sort of talk a little bit about that and about how like from a conservationist point of view, how do we push towards this what is seen as inconvenience?
Yeah, it's really hard, but I think we are making headway, especially writers like Dave Goulson, who championed bumblebees, have been chipping away at this horrible mindset we have about things like scrub is bad, shrubs are bad. Yeah, we need sort of lovely, clean nature. Whereas really nature is complexity and chaos. It's complexity, it's creating all kinds of habitats for all kinds of animals to all kinds of wildlife to thrive, diversity, enhancing biodiversity. Biodiversity can be quite an opaque term, but it's sort of maximizing the number of species and maximizing the number of individuals within each population of those species. But yeah, I mean, it's really, when I talk about complexity, I literally mean in the literal sense, the complexity of sort of, say, like a stand of brambles in a forest. That is brilliant habitat for all kinds of species, from insects to oak seedlings growing within that, compared to, a garden or a sanitized plantation with no sort of undergrowth. And it's sort of, for me, like things like undergrowth, scrub, brambles are sort of the perfect representation of what we need. We need that complexity and chaos in nature because it creates so many more opportunities for all kinds of life. And the wild boar, essentially sort of create that. When they are rooting, they create new opportunities for all this plant life to grow. But also sort of the rootings, as I say in the book, before the rootings grow over with vegetation, that sort of chaos of soil broken apart is really important for a lot of insects, and like ground nesting bees and things like that. So I think it's just about opening our minds to the fact that our idea of nature, yeah, as you say, is wrong. We need to sort of we need to relearn what our ancestors knew, what we've lost sight of.
Or even going
Yeah.
further, I think we need, like, to me, I feel like we need to accept that just because we don't understand it, like, doesn't mean we should interfere. And like, actually, if we see that there's a barrier of understanding, that is when we should absolutely stop interfering, like that very moment. Because there's, when people think about, I'm glad you mentioned undergrowth, because that is so important for, like, capturing rainfall even. And in the forest where I used to always sort of spend my summers growing up, the thing I've noticed over the last few years is just how dried out the undergrowth is. Because there's been a lot of, I don't want to get too sort of bogged down in details of that, but because of the way that forests had been managed or not managed, it created a situation where, like, a lot of deadfall has been removed from a forest.
Yeah, that's
And
removing the complexity. Yeah.
yes, and we would see, like, a fallen tree in the forest, and the next day it was just pulled out,
Yeah, we have that.
raising the ground, whatever. But it's and everything would dry out, and so the rain would fall, but it would just pour down and into the rivers and into the sea, and everything would be bone dry the very next day. And if we don't understand how an animal like wild boar, or by overturning the earth and kind of creating those groups, can help us sort of, maintain rainfall. We need to just observe a bit
Mm.
longer.
Yeah. And accept that, just because we don't control it doesn't mean it must be feared and that it's going to harm us.
Mm. But it's quite difficult, I think, going back to kind of communicating, and sort of, because obviously the concept of the show is storytelling, and that
Mm.
is, for me, communicating science it's such a crucial form of storytelling
Mm.
for the modern day. And it's very hard. It's so the way we make villains likable in fiction, that's, I think, the challenge that stands, in front of people like you, and because you have to come up with ways to make
Mm.
something that is not entirely lovable
Yeah.
and not not cuddly, um seem important.
Yeah. You're so right. And it's funny, yeah, because they kind of have been cast as villains by so many people throughout history, I suppose, but definitely today in the UK, where so many people have these ridiculous assumptions about them and are terrified of them for no real reason. And yeah, you say the challenge of writing good fiction is sort of getting into your, really making your characters not, well, yeah, not necessarily likable, not likable all the time, but understandable. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a great analogy.
I feel like, we have, uh collectively, I mean, I say we like I had something to do with it, but but collectively, we humans have done a great job, like, preserving honeybees, but honeybees are not the ones who are at risk of extinction.
Yeah.
But honeybees are the things that, like, oh, but they give us honey.
Yeah.
They're the good guys. They're our buddies because they give us the honey. And it's just,
Yeah.
but they're not actually the most efficient species at pollination.
Yeah. And you could argue that that's where like sort of communication has actually, we've messed up a bit there. Because yeah, there's all these, honey. Everyone's obsessed about the honeybees, but actually, there's so many other bees, the wild bees, the bumblebees, that need lots more attention, and we've completely forgotten about them.
Yes, but
By
it's,
say forgotten, I mean just yeah, we don't know that we should be paying attention to them.
yeah. I don't know what the sort of future of it is, but I think,
Yeah.
like, humans like things that kind of benefit them, even
Yeah.
in like some kind of outside way. So,
Mm.
like with the honeybees. So I think we just need to sort of find a way to show, but maybe with a wild boar, they will
Mm.
overturn the earth. And so all the water doesn't run down to the sea. And then,
Yeah.
things don't dry out for you.
Yeah, it's the
Right.
long game. It's
So,
the whole thing. I mean, payoff. We talk about, any kind of advice about writing fiction. You've got to have payoffs for your, in your storyline, and that is the Boar are all about ecological payoffs. They do cause sort of, they disturb the earth, but that ends up in the long run having really brilliant benefits for the environment. So it's about, yeah, not just looking at what is in front of us right now, but also thinking about the way that ecosystems work, because ecosystems do work to different timescales.
absolutely. And I think
Yeah.
understanding everything, like, how it works in this environment that we have right now is
Yeah.
going to be the long game, and it's
Yeah.
it's going to be just quiet observation.
Mm.
So thank you so much for coming
Yeah.
on the show, and I really enjoyed our chat. And I really wish you all the success with passing on the message of the wild boar and why we
Thank
should
you.
cherish it.
Thank you. It is brilliant. I do feel like I want to be an ambassador for the boar. So thank you very much for having me on the show, so I can continue to spread the gospel of the boar. And it's been really brilliant talking to you, especially as a fellow sort of writer and a fellow fantasy writer as well.
Thank you for watching the video. Every week there's something different, so click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you, and see you next week.